What happens when an undercover CEO walks into his own store and finds a cashier in tears? The truth he uncovers will leave you speechless. Daniel Grayson stepped out of his car and stared at the storefront. The bright red and white sign reading, Grayson's Market, was one he'd designed himself years ago. This store, one of 18 locations, was supposed to represent everything his company stood for: fair pay, happy employees, and loyal customers. But lately, complaints had been piling up. Customers reported rude staff and disorganized shelves. Worse, Daniel had received an anonymous letter claiming employees were being mistreated. His regional managers insisted everything was fine. Just a couple of lazy workers stirring up trouble, one of them had said. But Daniel knew better. If there was one thing he'd learned in business, it was that when employees were unhappy, there was always a reason. He adjusted his cap, pulled the collar of his faded jacket higher, and walked toward the entrance. Today, he wasn't the CEO. He was just another guy looking for work. Inside, the store felt off. Customers moved through the aisles quietly. The usual upbeat energy was missing. Shelves were half-stocked, and one display had toppled over. No one seemed in a hurry to fix it. Daniel spotted a woman in her mid-30s behind one of the registers, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Her name tag read, Kendra. Her face was red, her eyes swollen, like she'd been crying. He paused, pretending to scan a nearby shelf while keeping an eye on her. Kendra wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, plastered on a shaky smile, and forced herself to greet the next customer. Her voice wobbled. "I'm really sorry about the wait," she murmured. "Don't worry about it, hun," the elderly woman replied kindly. "Take your time." Kendra nodded, but her hands trembled as she scanned each item. When the customer left, Daniel watched her lean against the counter, biting her lip like she was trying to hold herself together. Then a voice shot across the floor. "Kendra!" A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark manager's vest stormed out from the back. His name tag read, Troy, the store's supervisor. "Why are you crying on the floor again?" Troy snapped. "I told you to keep it together at your register." "I'm fine," Kendra said quickly, blinking back tears. I'll be okay." "Yeah? Well, you better be." Troy's voice dropped lower. "You've already missed 2 shifts this month. Don't think I won't cut more of your hours if you keep acting like this." Daniel's stomach twisted. "I won't," Kendra whispered. "I promise." "Good," Troy muttered, before stomping off toward his office. Daniel turned back to the shelf in front of him, pretending to study a row of canned soup. His mind raced. That wasn't just bad management. That was intimidation. He couldn't say anything. Not yet. Not until he knew exactly what was happening in his store. But one thing was clear. Kendra was in trouble. And Daniel wasn't leaving until he found out why. Daniel kept a low profile for the rest of his shift. He shadowed a young cashier named Marcus, quietly scanning groceries while observing the flow of the store. But no matter where he was stationed, his eyes kept drifting back to Kendra. She kept her head down, barely speaking unless a customer approached her register. Her smile never reached her eyes. Something was clearly weighing her down. During his break, Daniel decided to follow his gut. He grabbed a snack from the vending machine and walked toward the break room. As he approached the door, he heard muffled sobs coming from inside. He paused, Kendra's voice. I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "I'm trying so hard, but it's never enough." "I know," another voice said softly. A young woman's voice, maybe another cashier. "Troy's been brutal lately, and now they're messing with your hours too." "He said I'm not reliable," Kendra said shakily. "Because I had to miss those shifts, but I didn't have a choice. My son," her voice broke. "I had to stay home with him when he was sick. I told Troy, but he didn't care. He's been cutting my hours ever since." "That's awful," the other voice said. "I'm so sorry. I can't even pay my gas bill this month." Kendra's voice cracked again. I barely made rent last week. I don't know what I'm going to do. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. Kendra's shift ended an hour later. Daniel waited outside the store, still in his disguise, watching as she stepped into the parking lot. She walked slowly, her shoulders slumped, clutching a worn-out purse tightly to her chest. He followed her from a distance, watching her stop by an old, battered sedan. She opened the car door, reached into her purse, then froze. Her hands trembled as she turned her wallet upside down, spilling coins into her palm. Daniel watched as she stared at the small pile of change in her hand, her face blank. Then suddenly, she covered her face with her hands and broke down. For a few seconds, Daniel just stood there. He felt like an intruder, watching her cry alone in the cold. He wanted to say something. Anything. But he knew she didn't need words right now. What she needed was help. The next morning, Daniel arrived early. He spent the first few hours restocking shelves and cleaning displays. While working, he quietly asked Marcus about what had been happening in the store. Kendra's got it the worst, Marcus admitted. Troy's been riding her hard for weeks, ever since she missed a few shifts. And that was only because her kid was in the hospital. Hospital? Daniel asked, his heart sinking. Yeah, Marcus said grimly. Her son has asthma. Bad. She had to stay home when he had an attack. He sighed. Troy says she's unreliable, been cutting her shifts like crazy. I think she's down to 15 hours a week now. That's barely part-time, Daniel muttered. Exactly, Marcus said. She's barely hanging on. Daniel's frustration deepened. This wasn't just bad management. This was deliberate cruelty. Later that day, Daniel finally confronted Troy. Got a second? Daniel asked, stepping into the manager's office. What now? Troy muttered, barely looking up from his clipboard. I heard about Kendra, Daniel said evenly. Heard you've been cutting her shifts. Troy's eyes narrowed. Yeah, so what? She's a good worker, Daniel pressed. Why are you reducing her hours? Troy laughed dryly. She's unreliable, missed too many days. Not my fault she can't keep her life together. Her son was sick, Daniel snapped. And you knew that. Look, Troy sneered. This isn't charity. If people can't balance their personal crap with their job, that's on them. I need reliable workers, not people who run home every time their kid sneezes. Daniel's fists clenched. So instead of supporting her, you're punishing her. I'm running a business, Troy said smugly. And guess what? Since I cut her hours, payroll's down, and corporate's been singing my praises. He smirked. Win-win. Daniel's stomach twisted with disgust. He turned and walked out of the office before he said something he couldn't take back. But in his head, one thing was certain. Troy's time here was over. That evening, Daniel quietly accessed the store's payroll system. His heart sank as he saw the evidence in black and white. Kendra's shifts had been steadily cut for weeks, not because she wasn't working hard, but because Troy wanted to manipulate payroll costs. And Kendra wasn't the only victim. Several employees had suffered the same treatment. Workers who had families, second jobs, or health issues. Anyone Troy considered inconvenient. Daniel clenched his jaw. This wasn't mismanagement. It was exploitation. He shut the computer down and sat in silence for a moment. Then he reached for his phone. Janet, he said when his assistant picked up. Clear my schedule tomorrow. I've got something to handle, personally. Tomorrow, Troy was going to learn the hard way that this wasn't just a store. It was Daniel's company. And nobody treated his employees like this. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the store early. This time, he wasn't in disguise. Dressed in his usual sharp suit, his CEO badge pinned to his blazer, Daniel walked through the front doors with purpose. Employees glanced his way, whispering among themselves. Some recognized him, others didn't, but they knew something was different. Troy, however, hadn't noticed him yet. He stood near the customer service desk, smugly flipping through schedules on a clipboard, casually sipping coffee like a man who believed he owned the place. Daniel walked straight up to him. Morning, Daniel said evenly. Troy barely looked up. You need something? Yeah, Daniel said. Your keys. Troy's head snapped up. Excuse me? Daniel reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved his CEO badge and held it up so Troy couldn't miss it. I'm Daniel Grayson, he said, his voice low but firm. I own this store. Troy's face shifted from irritation to confusion. Then, panic. I heard everything yesterday, Daniel continued. I know about Kendra's hours. I know about the employees you've been manipulating. And I know you've been cutting shifts to boost payroll numbers. Now hold on, Troy sputtered. This is all a misunderstanding. No, Daniel cut in sharply. It's not, he leaned in closer. I built this company to be a place where employees feel valued, not bullied into working fewer hours so some supervisor can make himself look good. Troy's face reddened. Look, I was doing what was best for the store. These people can't just expect handouts every time they have a bad week. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Supporting employees isn't a handout. It's what decent companies do. And this company is going to fix what you've broken. He extended his hand again. Now, your keys! For a moment, Troy stood frozen. Then, with a bitter scowl, he yanked the keys from his pocket and slammed them into Daniel's hand. You're making a mistake, Troy growled. These people are lazy. They'll run this place into the ground. No, Daniel said calmly. They're the ones who've been holding it together despite you. With Troy gone, Daniel called the employees together for a meeting. The break room was silent as they gathered, the tension in the air heavy. I know this has been a rough few weeks, Daniel started. And I know some of you have been treated unfairly. He paused, letting his words sink in. That ends today. He turned toward Kendra. She was sitting in the corner, her arms crossed, looking uncertain. Kendra, Daniel said gently, I'm sorry for what Troy put you through. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. Kendra's eyes widened. I didn't think anyone cared. I do, Daniel said firmly. And I'm going to make this right. He turned back to the room. Effective immediately, anyone whose hours were unfairly reduced will receive back pay for what they lost. We're also implementing new policies to ensure no employee can be intimidated or manipulated the way Troy treated this team. Whispers spread through the room, relief, disbelief, and cautious hope. Most importantly, Daniel continued, I need a strong leader to help this store rebuild. He turned back to Kendra. If you're willing, I'd like that person to be you. Kendra's mouth fell open. Me? You've been stepping up for weeks, Daniel said. Supporting your team. Staying strong even when things felt impossible. You've already proven you can lead. I'd just like to give you the title to match it. I don't know what to say, Kendra stammered. Her voice cracked. Thank you. Daniel smiled. You've earned it. Later that day, Daniel quietly lingered, near Register 4, pretending to browse while he watched Kendra work. She wasn't crying now. Instead, she moved confidently, smiling at customers and helping a nervous new employee adjust to the register system. The air in the store felt lighter, warmer, like the dark cloud Troy had cast was finally gone. Before leaving, Daniel stopped by her register one last time. You're going to do great, he said softly. I'll try, Kendra replied with a small smile. Don't try, Daniel said. You've already proved you can. Kendra stepped into the manager's office for the first time as the new assistant manager. The office still carried Troy's scent, stale coffee and cheap cologne. But as she sat down behind the desk, she felt something different. Relief. But that relief was short-lived. As soon as she opened the employee schedule, reality hit. The damage Troy had done ran deeper than she'd realized. Shifts were a mess. Several employees had been pushed to reduced hours, while Troy's favorites, a handful of workers who had kept quiet about his manipulation, had been given the best slots. Worse yet, Kendra discovered that some employees, particularly those with families, had been scheduled for impossible back-to-back shifts or long closing hours that clashed with their childcare needs. "He didn't just hurt me," she muttered under her breath. "He hurt everyone." She grabbed a notepad and started making a plan. The next day, Kendra gathered the staff for a meeting. The tension was thick. Employees still looked nervous, like Troy might storm back through the door at any moment. Some were whispering about Daniel's visit. Others stared blankly, clearly exhausted from weeks of stress. "I know things haven't been fair," Kendra began, her voice a little shaky. "I know some of you feel like no one's been listening, but things are changing now." The room stayed quiet. "Starting today," she continued, "everyone who had their hours unfairly cut will have them restored." The employees began to murmur, some in relief, some still hesitant. "If you have childcare issues, school schedules, or second jobs, let me know. We'll adjust the schedule to make things work. No one here should have to choose between keeping their job or taking care of their family." A few people in the back nodded. "Lastly," Kendra added, "if anyone ever feels mistreated, my door's always open. And if I don't fix it, you can go straight to Mr. Grayson himself." She smiled softly. He made that clear. For the first time, the room felt lighter. People smiled, whispered words of thanks, and seemed to exhale the fear they'd been holding in. But Kendra wasn't done yet. Later that day, she found Marcus near the stockroom, unloading boxes alone. "Hey," Kendra called. "Can you give me a hand at Register 2 when you're done here?" Marcus wiped his forehead. "Me? Yeah," Kendra said. "I saw you helping new hires last week. You're good with people. I need someone like that on the floor." Marcus blinked. I thought Troy said I wasn't customer-friendly enough." "Troy was wrong," Kendra said firmly. "I see how hard you work. The customers will too." For a moment, Marcus seemed too stunned to respond. Then, with a small smile, he nodded. "Yeah, okay." Over the next 2 weeks, the store began to change. Customers, who had grown used to slow service and frustrated staff, were now greeted with smiles. Employees walked with confidence instead of fear. Kendra kept her promises. Schedules became fair, breaks were respected, and over time, hours were tracked properly. Employees like Marcus, once overlooked, now thrived in their roles. One afternoon, Daniel returned to the store to see the results for himself. He lingered near the back, quietly observing. "I'll grab that for you," Marcus said cheerfully, loading bags into an elderly woman's cart. Nearby, a pair of employees restocked shelves together, chatting easily as they worked. And at Register 4, Kendra was helping a mother with her groceries while quietly distracting the woman's restless toddler with a sticker from her pocket. The mother laughed and thanked her before heading out the door. Daniel smiled. The store didn't just look better, it felt better. "I knew you could do it," Daniel said as he approached Kendra at her register. "I couldn't have without you," Kendra replied with a smile. "You gave me a chance. You earned it," Daniel said. "And I don't just mean the title." He paused. "I know things have been hard, but I'm glad you stuck with it." Kendra's smile faded slightly. "I almost didn't," she admitted quietly. "I came so close to quitting, so many times. But I couldn't. I couldn't let Troy win." "I'm glad you didn't," Daniel said, "because this store, these people, they need you." "I know," Kendra said softly, "and I need them too." For the first time in weeks, Kendra felt like she belonged, not just in the store, but in her role as a leader. And she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her again.